In this chapter, the author said that some scholars think that Mark minimized the Roman responsibility or culpability for Jesus and his crucifixion, and they maximized the Jewish part. And so they say that the Gospel of Mark is this apologia to the Romans, written to benefit the Roman church, Christian church. That Mark wanted to dissociate the Roman church from the idea that Jesus died at the hands of the Romans as a rebel. So this is kind of like a cover-up. But other scholars say, well, they accept that he was kind of writing this for the Roman church benefit, that Jesus was not covering up anything. He was, in fact, innocent of subversive activity. But the authors say, well, if that's the case, then portraying their portrayal of Jesus as an apolitical person makes their reading of Mark wrong, because that's the way this book is approaches the reading of Gospel Mark is they take a political view of it. So you have these at least two viewpoints of what was the purpose, or why did Mark write it the way he did. Then they get into this that most scholars, probably the lay public, doesn't appreciate this use of parody and irony in the Gospel of Mark. So I looked up, a parody is a literary work intended to mock or ridicule. So here's some examples that I thought showed some evidence of parody or irony. One was that when Jesus meets is brought into council and they're interrogating, well, they bring some false witnesses, but they can't get their witnesses, false witnesses, give the same testimony. They can't get their act together. So to me, that might be an example of parody. I think that they would have kind of said beforehand, coach them a little bit, here's what you all need to say, but they didn't get that worked out. And a bit of irony is the charges they bring against Jesus, they're true, and then Jesus, with his confession, convicts himself, which I don't think that's one that I really.
He did say it was the human. At one point, he does say the side. And what's interesting in the book is,
well, he says, I am.
But in the book, they have I am question mark.
Yeah.
As what Jesus says.
Yeah, and they say
the gospel says.
Yeah, they say that it could have been read, am I? Like, and he kind of says in the second trial, he kind of says something like, so say you, or something like that. Like, that's what you say. This idea of Pilate, though, as being weak, easily pressured by the high priest, or listening to the crowd seems ludicrous to me, because he was infamous for being cruel and violent. He was actually, a few years later, after Jesus' crucifixion, he was recalled because he was of some of the acts that he performed of cruelty. So I have a hard time believing that Pilate actually paid any attention to the high priest. The high priest was somebody he picked, so I don't think he was particularly weak or easily influenced. Then these both trials basically are railroad or Jesus. They know he's opposed to them and would like to see them overthrown. Any examples that you thought of that I could think of that you might cite for parody or irony in these two trials?
You did a better job than I did, because I tried to figure out where there was parody or where there was irony, and you've identified something that I overlooked.
So here's the scripture. Any volunteers to read, or you want me to read?
They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. Peter had followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards, warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and gave false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.' But even on this point, their testimony did not agree." Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" But he was silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power, and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You've heard this blasphemy. What is your decision?" All of them condemned him as deserving death. Some began to spit on him and blindfold him and to strike him, saying to him, "Prophecy, prophecy." The guards also took him over and beat him.
Okay, so there's the high priest and Jesus.
That's interesting. If the authors are correct, I haven't researched. But if the Sanhedrin could not condemn somebody to death, then why are they yelling, "Kill him"? They don't have the power to do that. I mean, they clearly they bind him over to Pilate, but Pilate said,
Well, I wasn't sure. I mean, so Jesus is charged in the end. The high priest charges him with blasphemy.
Because of Jesus' own words.
But I thought blasphemy was the penalty that they would stone you to death. I thought I wasn't clear. To me, I thought that was a penalty. I mean, later he even gets stoned.
Yes, but while the Romans were there, they weren't allowed to pass the death penalty.
Well, the Romans were there when Stephen was there.
Paul was there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, anyway,
I mean,
I thought they had the power, so I'm not sure why they. You thought they did not?
Well, the authors even make the point they didn't have.
No. That's why they took him to Pilate.
Well,
Of course,
talking
Pilate
about-
was gone by then, wasn't he, during Stephen stoning? Or
no,
was
I
he
don't
still
think
there?
that- I don't know about that, but
Well, the point I was trying to make by saying about Paul or Saul was a Roman citizen. But he, in a sense, he could be standing in for Rome in the stoning of Stephen. I mean,
Never thought of that.
so, okay. I hadn't thought it that way. He was also a Jew. So, one thing I was kind of curious about was that before he was charged with blasphemy, they accused him of threatening to destroy the temple. Well, is that really true? And I don't have my scripture with me. Somebody, what did Jesus actually say about the temple? Right.
I thought he said that the curtain would be pulled. But
Well,
when did he say that?
No, he didn't say that. That's what is later reported to happen when he died on the cross.
I thought he said it.
There was some place where he was talking to disciples and he used that terminology saying, "I'll destroy this temple in 3 days, it'll be built up." Talking about himself, not talking about physical.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we just read that. He was prophesying his death and resurrection.
Right, that's what I was thinking
I'm curious, and I guess I'm going to do the Bible.
about. We'll Google it. We'll
Throw one in
Google
there?
it for you.
Okay. I thought he just said these stones will all be thrown down and there won't be one stone left on another.
Well, he said that too.
So
Jesus predicts temple.
So that's one question. We'll let them look that up. But my other question is, why did they make this charge against Jesus about the temple? What kind of, it must have been kind of important to them because they later, when Jesus is on the cross, they say this about him again, about the temple. Anybody want to speculate why they think that the temple
Because
is
the temple was the Holy of Holies. And
Okay.
to tear down the temple would have been like sacrilege or blasphemous, or I don't know.
It also would have been center of the religion, therefore, to take, which is in their culture, actually kind of their laws, land.
That's where they believe God actually dwelled.
How about I'll just take a more practical approach here. The Jewish economy in Jerusalem was heavily dependent on the temple. Be an argument I would make that a lot of people depend on that temple for people. All the people came in, did trade, and all this. Maybe if your livelihood was dependent upon the existence of the temple, I would say maybe that was the reason why they were kind of concerned about this charge of the temple being destroyed. I thought that was the point the authors made was I hadn't thought of it that way.
You know, both points could be valid.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Who's listening?
Yeah,
You know,
right.
if you're trying to convince the Jews to get rid of the house of God thing, and if you're trying to get the Romans to say, well, there's an economic impact here that's going to affect taxes and then tear down the temple.
Well, I was taking the economic impact on the Jews too.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the
yeah,
high
so-
priests and
particularly the high priest and the
Sanhedrin and
Well,
the
those-
temple
yeah.
authorities.
plus the people that sell the
Yeah.
food to them and the land
The
to them and
sacrifices.
everything else.
Yeah, well, how would you
And
react
change
if
the
somebody
money.
said they're gonna tear down in 3 days your place of employment? Things are changed.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I would have been happy if my place of employment had been turned down.
Oh, well, bad example.
Of course, I worked for the
Yeah,
IRS for about
yeah, it really
15
is.
years.
You'd be sued for blasphemy.
I always thought when I read that scripture in the past, you know, you have all these false witnesses. I mean, it really does remind me of just a gang that is like, well, you know, let's just throw out some accusation that I know it isn't true, but we're going to throw it out there in order to anger everybody. And it's like as many as you can get is fine. And then, you know, in the end, the priest didn't need to prove anything because Jesus did it himself, you know, so they're just looking for a reason to condemn.
well, what was
False news.
Yeah.
what's some other little parts of this whole thing? At least the first trial. When does it take place? At
Well,
night.
At night, yeah. The night that they grabbed him.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I was wondering about the trial also was, although Jesus implicates himself, so maybe if he knew he was going to do that, there's no witnesses to testify in his favor. That's kind of like another example that this is kind of a railroad job.
Yeah.
No defense for Jesus, false witnesses on the other side.
He doesn't have a lawyer to tell him not to take the
Yeah.
stand. And
Yeah.
testify.
Yeah, there's no Fifth Amendment yet. So.
Well, I had written down here that the blasphemy was a capital offense. So I guess I'll have to research that because I guess I still think it is because of what happened to Steve. Anyway,
Dennis, look at Mark 13, 1 through 23 to see if that's what we want. And it has both, I think it has the stone and,
Mark 13. What?
1 through
what did I say?
20 something.
1 through 23.
Okay, and he came, and as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Well,
There's no reference there to 3 days.
there. What's that?
don't
Not
think
yet, wait.
There's no reference there to 3 days, but
No.
the 3 days thing, I think is. Yeah, I always thought that reference part was to the upcoming, or how you view the author to the past destruction of the temple when Jews rebelled against in 70.
Right. When they had the revolt.
Right. But the other one, if you're a Christian, you take the other quote symbolically. You equate the temple with the body of Christ, and there will be prison after 3 days. But if you're not a Christian, if you're the Sanhedrin or you're other Jews, and someone says they're going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, or whatever, that does seem blasphemous towards the temple.
Well, I don't know. I guess I'm going to take the devil's advocate and say, well, if he had said he was going to do it, he himself is going to do it. But if he's just saying, well, I'm just saying this is what's going to happen.
But,
Well, he's implying that he's gonna.
Okay.
That specific number, it's gone too.
Okay.
He was planning on
I
using.
don't know if John and Mark are talking together.
But yeah,
Well, John was later.
even that threat in Mark though would certainly
Freak out
make
the
people fear him.
Yeah.
Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. That's pretty specific.
Okay, so here's what it says in John, though. That doesn't really say I will destroy it. In John, remember this is John, not Mark. So Jesus answered him saying, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." It is. Then the Jews said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he spoke of the temple of his body. I still think he's innocent on that charge, that he didn't say he would destroy it.
There you go. You're a good lawyer.
Okay, so
yes, well, he had no lawyer, so
No.
He was going to use 3D printing.
And the law about blasphemy being punishable by death is from Leviticus 24:16.
okay. Well, on the temple charge, Jesus didn't respond to that stuff, those charges, but then the high priest asked him, and he does respond, and in doing so, he convicts himself.
Well, the question then
Jesus is pretty clever about some responses.
Yeah. If Leviticus says that blasphemy can be punishable by stoning to death, why does he send him out? Why doesn't he just all of them go out in the courtyard and start throwing stones?
Okay, what do you think?
I'm asking the question.
Okay.
I think they were trying to avoid the Jews that were followers of Jesus from putting it back on them, that they thought the general Jewish public would think that the Romans were the bad guys, not the Sanhedrin.
Yeah, I think that's it. That's the same reason why Pilate said, "I wash my hands. This is an innocent man." It's like nobody wants to take the blame just in case they're wrong. It wasn't me,
Well, we'll get into at least one reason in response to Jonathan's question. Then we have this little, this is one of these sandwich things, sort of, I skipped a few verses, but in the midst of this, there's this other little story going on between the two trials. There's this thing about Peter. Does somebody else want to read about?
Yeah, I'll read it. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards warming himself at the fire. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you are talking about." And he went out into the forecourt. Then the cock crowed, and the servant girl, on seeing him, began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again he denied it. Then after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know this man you are talking about." At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered all that Jesus had said to him. "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept.
Oh, what was Peter doing in the courtyard anyway?
With the guard, trying to find out what was.
Well, what did he told Jesus before?
That he wouldn't leave him.
Right home.
So
He'd stand by him.
he was sort of trying to, like, to follow Jesus, be there with him. You know. So why did the servant girl? Why did she call out Peter? Why did she identify him?
I think because she recognized him.
Well, she recognized him, but one Jew to another. But who is she the servant of?
The high priest.
High priest. So she kind of has
She might
an
tell on
incentive
him.
to be supportive of the high priest. Right?
Yeah, she might tell on him.
So what gave Peter away as a Galilean?
Wasn't it his like,
His accent or whatever. He probably
Dialect.
maybe he spoke like, somebody's from the South, you'd say, "Oh, they're Galilean." Or you're from Boston, you got that Boston accent.
I don't know that this is right. Maybe he would have spoken Aramaic.
Yeah.
Maybe they were speaking to him.
Yeah, I don't know that. The author said it was his accent that gave him away. So he was, maybe got a goal. Like, yeah.
That would be a different way of telling the story.
But do you think Peter's life was in danger when he recognized as one of Jesus' followers?
Probably.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's what he thought.
Okay. But he wasn't arrested when Jesus was arrested. They all fled, but the Romans didn't go out and capture and arrest them.
Well, they were only supposed to give the one that Judas kissed.
Okay.
And everybody was scattering every way.
I'm sure the philosophy was to get the remedy to everybody else.
Yeah.
Maybe thought, well, they may not crucify you. They might give me 39 lashes or something.
The authors are pretty dramatic about it.
Yeah.
This story is part of Mark's dark political cartoon, the dramatic enactment of Jesus' warnings about the Faustian bargain of self-preservation. Drama.
What's a Faustian bargain?
Devil.
Well, it's typically when you give away something that's spiritual or moral or eternal value for something that worldly or temporary.
Who was it? Daniel Webster that sold his soul for something like that.
Yeah.
There's a
Hold
song
this-
about that.
Sold his soul to the devil, but we don't know.
Yeah. Guy who became a good, the song is the guitar,
Right, but yes, and I was thinking too.
yeah. Daniel Webster.
So what were Peter's options when, after he was recognized? What could he, besides denying Jesus, what could he have done?
He could have owned up to it or fled.
He could have ran away.
Yeah, fled.
He could have testified for Jesus.
Yeah.
He got dragged in there.
Well, the Bible says that after the crucifixion, they were all kind of hiding out.
Yeah.
And because they were all scared that they would come after them.
So he laments after he
Been honest about it, and said, yeah, I heard him preach, but I never did anything he said.
Which was not false.
That's true from Peter. Never really got it.
I heard him, but I'm still trying to figure out what he did.
Yeah.
So what was the cost of his decision?
Well, one, he was really upset with himself for doing it
Yeah.
after it had happened. And that probably weighed on him the rest of his life, and affected his ministry from thereafter.
Yeah, it was a turning point for him. It devastated him. So it's one of those once in a lifetime experiences that made him who he became.
He realized Jesus knew him better than he knew himself. I guess.
Yeah.
Well, it might have been a positive outcome too, because had he admitted he was, had he been arrested and thrown in prison and dealt with or whatever, maybe he never would have become the apostle that he became. And favorable outcome.
For Christianity, for sure.
It's kind of like it wasn't in the script. You know, that wasn't what Jesus wrote that was supposed to be happening from the beginning. Because Peter was going to be his rock.
Yeah, it's not unusual for people to hit rock bottom, and then from that point on to climb up and pick achievements or accomplishments. Maybe this is something Peter had to go through.
Well, it's a common theme, the transformation.
Right? So now we're going to move on to the next scriptures. Here's Jesus in front of Pilate. Anybody else want to read? Side forward.
I can read it, I can see it from both. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders, and scribes, and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Did you answer? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the festival, he used to prisoner for them anyone for whom they asked. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. And he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd and had him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with him called the king of the Jews?" And they shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them, Why, what evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them. After flogging Jesus, he handed him crucified. Then the soldiers led him courtyard of the palace, that is the governor's headquarters. I called together the whole cohort and clothed them in a purple cloak. After twisting thorns into the crowd, they put it on him. Again, saluting Hail, King of the King. Struck his head with spat upon him, knelt down in a modesty. After mocking him, they stripped him purple cloak and put on his own clothes on. Crucified.
It doesn't say wash my hands. It doesn't.
And where's else? Oh, here. Pilate talking to the crowd, and there's Jesus with what thorns on his head and purple coat.
Who made buttons for the choir that one, that free Barabbas?
I
Do you
forgot
remember
all
that?
that. No,
You guys all wore buttons.
I could have surprised what my mom came up with.
Yeah.
But what we're talking about all this stuff. The elephant in the room is this: we have God in the form of a human playing fiddle with humans. Essentially, that's what's going on. Jesus-
Right, playing fiddle.
He knows what he's doing. He's doing everything. He knows how he's accomplishing the goals, and he's doing it to essentially complete that. And so he's the human condition. Humans don't know what's happening. They're just old mob mentality, right? And he's playing them like a fiddle. That's exactly what.
Right?
So all of this really really doesn't need to be hammered out. It's a game. Played a game.
You think so?
Absolutely. Why wouldn't
That's it.
he's not human?
But the night before he said, he said,
He's kind of human. I'll give you that.
If he's not full of
Dilemma.
food, then
If he's not human, how did he rise from the dead?
he was human. That doesn't mean to do
Throw that out there.
it. Okay. Well, I think that's one viewpoint is that Jesus, in John particularly, Jesus comes out as fully control of what's going on. It doesn't come out that way. Mark,
I've always felt that was written. It was written, so it had to happen. It's written before time.
When we play cards, we played cards at Grace. Grace's house was the Aaron house, playing pitch. And if you play the hand we did well, you always play that strategy. That's what he did.
Jesus being called King of the Jews was Pilate's contemptuous reminder that the Jews weren't sovereign in their own land. That's what the defiant King Herod was called, King of the Jews. It's kind of a not so subtle reminder that the Romans were dark. Okay, now why the two trials? Back to doctrine. Did the Jewish high court need Pilate's approval to carry out its own capital punishment? If they didn't, why the second trial?
Well, the high priest were always afraid that if they did something, the crowds might riot. So, I don't know.
Well, if they weren't sovereign in their land, then they didn't have that.
Yeah.
They had the laws, they didn't have the authority.
Maybe the Romans had given them that as their agent, local agent.
well, these authors are very much focused on social justice.
Yeah.
And so they would interpret Mark as trying to say that Christians, followers of the way, must stand against not only organized religion, but also organized government. So he stands against both those, and he perseveres in the resurrection, which says we too must stand against improper government.
Only if it's unjust, though. I would say.
That's my definition of improper.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, Rome was very oppressive, and so were the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Well, some comments, observations about trials. If you read the two trials, they're very similar. I mean, the questioning, the responses, the silence, and all those things take place. They're kind of parallel. So, what is with this obvious parallelism between the Jewish trial and the Roman trial? That suggest? What is Mark suggesting about Jewish and Roman culpability in this critical railroading of Jesus?
I kind of see it as people culpability.
The two trials are just
Rubber stand. Go back to what I said earlier. I think it's showing the coordination between the church, which is not really serving God, and the people, and the government, which is not serving God, and those. It shows that coordination there.
so they were working together and cooperating. Both people responsible in Mark's eyes, which those scholars we talked about first. This is kind of his way of saying no. It's not trying to implicate Jews only; it's implicating them both.
The word I'm thinking of, overwhelm. You just want to overwhelm everything. So there can be no rebuttal.
I think there's a history where politics and religion hand in hand, because politicians realize that religion is an easy way to control people. We saw that, studied the history of Christianity, and the church and the government often in collision thing.
And in those days, they're all that intertwined. We talk about church and state in the United States, but 2,000 years ago in Palestine, that all
maybe that's
intertwined. You didn't separate that out like we do today. So.
maybe that's why the American fathers, put that in the Constitution. That's what's trying to keep us two apart.
Yeah, that's good. I was just thinking that, thinking again about the early Christian movement, once it became a part of the government, this is when they looked back at this scripture to talk about anti-Semitism, so it's when kind of started that process where, still today people are against Jews because they killed Jesus, and I do think that the early Christian church perpetuated that.
Yeah, well, we've read several of Amy Jill Levine's. Amy Jill Levine tells in one of her books that when she was in grade school, she went home one day saying, "So and so said that I killed Jesus," and she was like, "Where'd that come from?" Well, that's kind of background.
The KKK have the burning cross.
Going back for a second about, the whole being sentenced to death is going to do that. Possible that the religious leaders were trying to get Rome to execute him because it was Passover and they didn't sell.
That's a good point. I think that's right there in the midst of it. Why couldn't they have postponed the
Yeah.
crucifixion a few days?
I mean, you know, they're in Jerusalem, the holiest city. Even Stephen, I think, when the stone was not stoned in Jerusalem, outside the wall of Jerusalem. So they probably deal with Jesus that way. And it was probably a business problem.
What's interesting though is if the gospel makes it seem as if the high priest are manipulating Pilate, and yet you made the point that Pilate was your system. You know, it was not easily, very politically astute, at least until he wasn't. And so, you know, is it really believable that he was manipulated, or did he really feel? I mean, part of the authors say that crucifixion was a result of insurrections. People threatened to kill. Maybe Pilate sincerely believed that this Jewish Messiah could knock out the props under the empire. So, if he is a Messiah, in the sense that Jews were waiting for a Messiah, then in a kingly battle, you know, that would really affect. Yeah.
Yet he said, this guy did nothing wrong.
Well, I know
That's the way the
He
story
did
goes.
everything
that's the way
to
Mark
set
says it.
him free.
Pilate didn't. Well, Barabbas had murdered somebody in insurrection already, so you set free a guy who's already done murder, or a guy who simply says he's king of the Jews and hasn't really
Wasn't
done
he,
anything yet.
wasn't Barabbas a rebel that was fighting against Rome?
Okay.
Yeah, so
Okay, so the crucifixion is the most reliable fact we have about Jesus, that he was crucified by the Romans, and that was their punishment for enemies of the Roman state. So we talked about this already. He was crucified instead of stoned to death. Maybe Paul's right that they didn't want to have blood on their hands during the Passover. Maybe that's a possibility. Maybe they just wanted to pass the buck over to the Romans so they can say, well, that's what we want to have happen. We want somebody else to do it for us. Somebody else does the dirty work for us.
It always struck me strange that the week before, all the people thought Jesus was wonderful. And now they want to crucify. How did that happen?
Doesn't one of the scriptures say that the Jewish leaders, when they put him up for Barabbas or Jesus, that the Jewish leaders were bribing the people and giving them money? Isn't that in one of the
It says
gospels?
that they were encouraging them.
I thought in one of the gospels it said
I'm not sure it talks about money.
I don't remember that
gave
part.
them money.
In Mark, it doesn't say that. It just says that they were stirring the crowd. So what do you think? What about this offer? Pilate offers the crowd a choice between Jesus and Barabbas, who's a convicted terrorist. Is that plausible? I mean, if you think about who Pilate is, or is that Mark wrote the story?
You know, if I'm Pilate, I'm a very cruel, controlling dictator of sorts. I'd let him have a choice too, and then later on I'd take care of Barabbas.
Okay.
So, you know, what's lost?
Yeah.
You give the people a sense of choice. But that's only if I were Pilate.
From now on, you're going to be
Well,
Pilate.
I'm glad
You
you
know, I
said
think
that.
Mark is trying to show that the people were so blind that they chose the bad guy as their hero. Let the good guy go to his death.
well, except did they see him as a bad guy, or did they see him as a good guy because he was, you know, ambushing the Romans?
Yeah, who's he fighting for?
Well, I mean, they both kind of had that background, if that's the case.
But one is violent and one is non-violent. So who's actually, in their eyes,
Well, I think in this moment, it's, you know, the priests, the propaganda, that the
Yeah.
priests are setting up as being very effective against the people are believing it. You know, most of Jesus' ministry, I think, took place in Galilee. He's really only been there a few weeks. Made their final journey, it was kind of with the intent of coming to the Passover. So how really well did the people know Jesus? Some of them. It's easy to sway their emotions. The politics.
I'm going to skip this last question. We're going to go on the next page.
It really does show that mob mentality. That's
Yeah.
the problem with sheep, you know.
So we're talking about the mob, so here's some points that I thought were interesting. Would any Jewish crowd have advocated that any Jew be crucified by the Romans who they hated?
I wouldn't think so.
I kind of have a problem with that.
Yeah.
And then like Les is asking, well, this is my question. Is this the same crowd that cheered Jesus as he entered Jerusalem earlier in the week that's now calling for his crucifixion? I would contend, no, it's two separate crowds. The high priest had their crowd that was from Jerusalem. The other crowd came in from the rural areas, because we talked about that a little bit. They went out and they had cut, they came prepared with palms already cut, which kind of suggested that it was a rural crowd that was cheering his entry into Jerusalem. So I've always, in my mind, thought, no, this wasn't a fickle crowd that one day he's a great and the next day he's condemned. I've always thought, in my mind, it makes sense that there's two separate crowds.
Well, I'll be the contrarian.
Okay.
Suppose you're one of the Jews on the side of the roadside, and you hear about this Messiah coming in the Jews, and he's riding on a colt. Everybody gets enthusiastic, lays down the palms, and they're saying, "This guy is the Messiah. He is going to deliver us from the Roman Empire." Okay, and a couple of days later, you see him partially naked, crown of thorns, stripes on his back, and Rome is there saying, "Who do you want?" Wouldn't you think, well, I guess he's not who I thought he was? Okay, and say, okay,
so he's a false Messiah, and we should get rid of him.
Yeah,
he deserves what he's getting.
Let Rome take care of it. I can see the change in events and settings could cause, and I don't view the crowd as sheep. I view them as simply very human, reacting to the situation. They thought, hey, here's our Messiah, and then whoops, I guess.
Well, they're easily manipulated.
Yeah.
You like that, okay. That's no way.
But then we just talked about the servant girl. And she had a vested interest in supporting the high priest. Maybe the crowd was filled with the high priest servants.
Yeah.
Could be.
Well, here's an interesting little. Barabbas means son of the Father. You remember at Jesus' baptism, there was a voice from heaven that said, "You are my son, the beloved, with you I am well pleased." So I wonder if this was, to me, this has puzzled me for, that seems to be an interesting little detail of the son of the Father. Is this another instance of Mark using irony because the crowd was pleased to choose Barabbas instead of Jesus? That more than once I read that seems to be a play on words.
So does that mean there wasn't a Barabbas? Or it was James, Peter, or somebody else? They gave him Barabbas.
No, I didn't go that far, but I just saying this.
It could have been Jesus' brother.
What's the story? The name.
Well,
So I did not
That's what I'm
realize
saying.
that
I mean,
either.
Yeah.
did Mark make up some of this, or we can believe it, it's historically accurate?
There's only embellished.
Well, it's not.
That's why we
historically
have 4 gospels. They couldn't get it right. Yeah. So
Okay, any other examples of parody you want to bring up? I'm going to go back to this other question. I thought this was an interesting idea. I never thought about it this way, but it says the authors think that Mark was satirizing the gladiator games in the Roman Colosseum, where after the battle, the fight between the gladiators, there was whoever was fighting the crowd would give them a thumbs up or thumbs down to live or die. And there's this kind of a Mark's satirization of Jesus and Barabbas, of which one of the crowd's going to choose. That was something I'd never
Weren't the Jews more interested in a more or less military overthrow of the Rome, and that was Barabbas' thing,
Yeah.
Okay,
as opposed to Jews.
okay, so we're bringing that up.
You're ahead of me.
Barabbas was imprisoned as a rebel, committed murder in the insurrection, a violent revolutionary. Evidently, he was popular with the crowd, at least one crowd. But why was he popular?
Because he ambushed the Romans, killed them.
Kind of what Russ was saying. He was supporting the revolution that they were, at least one segment of the population was.
Well, and many of Jesus' followers wanted Jesus to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, he kept trying to say, no, we can do it peacefully, and they're like, but let's kill him.
Yeah.
You know, so
So we
that
have,
might be another reason that they leaned toward Barabbas, because he was actually doing what they thought needed to be done.
It depends on your point of view, because Barabbas, a lot like Skywalker, Skywalker was a hero in Star Wars, but he certainly killed people, and he certainly was in insurrection fighting against the resistance. So a lot of people, with Skywalker, a lot of people thought that way forever.
He turned. He wouldn't kill his father.
so here we have two types of revolution: violent, non-violent. They both were in prison and facing execution for their approach. The crowd chose Barabbas. Like we talked, evidently they supported the violent revolution. And what happened to the Jews in their revolt? They were crushed.
So what, I know Mark is writing this after the insurrection was put down, but if he's talking about Jesus' time, what insurrection is he talking about related to Barabbas? Was there another one going on right now?
Well, I think,
Or is it
Go
just
ahead,
always,
Lee.
it was just always insurrection?
I thought there were always small bands of people doing insurrection-ish things at the same time.
there were other insurrections before the one in 66 to 70. And there was another insurrection in like 133 or something like that later, led by another, some guy named Simon that was crushed also.
No,
And then there was
so,
like
yeah, I
the
get
people
that.
of
But I
Masada
just, it sounds like Mark is being
did
very
constant.
specific that Barabbas had committed murder in the insurrection. Well, that sounds special.
Well, I kind of took it as the insurrection was the one of 66 to 70.
Okay, so you think Mark's talking about a later event then?
I guess I probably do. But there were a lot of insurrections between the Jews revolting against the Romans or against whoever was in power when they were.
Gonna say in one of the Easter movies, they have the crowd start the rebels starting a fight in but I can't remember if that's biblical or if that was just an embellishment of one of the movies.
Well, what did Jesus say about the sword? Bill, that
In support of the
Except for Barabbas.
Jews, they never knew any other kind of revolution. There was never, in their history, there had only been a violent revolt.
okay.
So a peaceful revolt is kind of beyond their comprehension.
Well, they did come into Canaan land. What they do to the Canaanites?
Yeah.
It wasn't
Well, look at today.
exactly peaceful.
Look at today. We still can't figure out how to do things peacefully. Sounds like why we keep having, well, doesn't figure it out.
Yeah.
It's not a new thing. Here,
In the word in our world,
I think a picture I have of.
Somebody's talking on this thing.
the brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's novel. There's the Grand Inquisitor. This is the Grand Inquisition, Great Inquisition in Spain. Thousands were killed. And in this story, Jesus comes back quietly, humbly at that time. But the Grand Inquisitor says that he's going to be condemned, burned at the stake as the worst of heretics because his teachings are threatening social order, established social order, and they're unrealistic. And those, like the fickle crowd, our story, who kissed his feet, they're going to rush up, but heap up embers on the fire. So that's pretty dramatic story. So here's some questions to think about. What about Dostoevsky's story or Peter's denial of consciousness today? Do we sometimes deny reality when we find it too painful to face? Have we seen Jesus and pretended not to know him to save face, to stay safe, avoid upsetting the established social order? So, you're free to comment.
Well, as far as denial, yeah, sometimes it's a protection that you're trying to shield yourself from my own life. I knew what was happening, but I was still in denial.
Okay.
Because the alternative was too traumatic.
We can't imagine another option.
Yeah, you're kind of stuck at that point. And I've also wondered about recently, I haven't read the Brothers Karamazov, but I have wondered if maybe Jesus has come back and we just say, we just don't recognize it.
Well, there are stories. I mean, these are, story of like the old man that has a dream where Jesus is going to visit him, and 3 people show up, each needing something, and he provides that for him. And later on, I remember he says, "Well, Lord, why didn't you come?" Well, I did come 3 times, and he tells him, "Well, I did."
Well, and sort of like the conversely, the story of the guy who wouldn't leave the
Nadine story last week, where the guy's on the roof and he's gonna drown if somebody doesn't come in. He says, "No, help's on the way. You take this boat. I don't need to." Then he goes to heaven and says, "Well, what happened? Why didn't you show up?" "Well, I did it 3 times, but you turned me away each time."
Well, this sort of begs the question then, based on the conversation, is do we believe that Jesus coming again at a historical event? Or so the one we're to be looking for is in the face of other people, especially those people? Or are the prophecies of the Bible accurate in the physical event? I've heard it.
I was going to say, can it be both ways at the same time? I mean, can it be both?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it kind of together. Both, that Jesus comes physically, that's the answer. If we don't see Jesus come physically like the Bible says, then we have to look for Jesus.
There's an interesting novel that I read probably 3 years ago that the name of it is The Gospel According to Pilate. And it's kind of a mystery and a thing, and so 2 or 3 different storylines going on at the same time, but it deals with a morphe that they find somebody has found, and it's got some scripts in it that tells different things, and it talks in the thing. It follows the Jesus being taken to Pilate and how he dealt with it. And it's a very interesting concept that you see it from his point of view. And, it's a novel, but I really enjoyed it and made me think, about some different things. Plus, it was fun to read.
Star Wars,
And by the way, I just was Googling Barabbas. He has a first name. You guys know what his first
Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just Googled it too.
That's
And
that makes my point. They're both the son of the father, because the father was capitalized at your slide.
Interesting.
Well, but he could also be the son of his father.
Yeah,
That would have been a lowercase out.
what depends if you capitalize.
Well, the other thing too is like Jonathan means gifts with God. That doesn't mean first of all, Jonathan doesn't have to with God, but
That's right.
there are lots
We're
of
all
Jonathans,
gifts.
and there are probably lots of Barabbases. So I guess my point is, it doesn't have to be irony. It could be historically accurate because there are lots of Barabbases walking around. There are other Jesuses walking. There are the James and Johns walking.
Yeah.
Well, I capitalized the S and the F
Oh,
because
same
that's
thing.
what the authors.
I need
Yeah.
I thought about that. I said, well, should be.
One of the
One
other-
has
tricky.
a
It's
theological
tricky.
implication, the other one.
it's tricky.
the other- the other-
Well, and the other thing,
writing later
back
on.
on Steve's point earlier, and this raised a whole nother issue for a whole class.
Oh, good. Let's do that.
Whether Jesus is human or purely God, there's also a philosophy that he at some point in time became the true Son of God. And that could have been at the point of the crucifixion where he gave up his earthly soul. So it doesn't mean that he wasn't human during his lifetime. It also doesn't mean not the only begotten Son of God.
Wasn't it the Essenes who thought he was never fully human?
Well,
I don't know if it seems
I can't remember.
Talk
Oh, the
about
Gnostics.
Jesus.
The
Yeah.
Gnostics.
Gnostic.
Sorry, I've got my people mixed up.
Well, Paul basically takes what you were talking about there as Jesus at his resurrection is adopted as God's son.
so he's
I
either
think
always
that's it.
God, always human, or he's only at a certain point in time, or
I mean, for 400 years or 300 or 400 years, they debated this. Came up with, well, he's fully human and he's fully divine, which I don't know if you can be, maybe you can be fully divine and not be God.
What was the one point that you studied about where before Jesus died, spiritual self left because you couldn't kill God? So, fully human
Oh.
after his death.
Yeah. What was that?
That was a,
Because his.
what was that group of?
heavenly part,
they're all
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They all became virgins, but there wasn't. a
Right.
name
That's
for
true.
it.
So I think it's both metaphorical and
I think the answer is it's metaphorical. It's all real.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's Dennis.
I think that's the correct answer.
Yeah.
We're going into the chapter. I mean, into the office. Yeah.
It could be the.
Yes. Two books.
You wanna get me one?
I forgot all about that.
Along with every.
So Jane and Dennis. talking about
How much do we need to?
Oh, okay.
I have to feel which one is mine.
Then you can tell Dennis.
My daughter took me to a bookstore and she said, "Baby, I can feel that this is what- reach me out now."
Can you figure out the
I
right one?
I think I did. This
I don't
one's mine.
find any of this
Just the next
behavior are unbelievable because if you look at today and how susceptible some people are to propaganda,
Yeah.
it's like, that's just human behavior.
I'm not.
That's just how we are.
Try to do that.
Well, it's possible. I still favor the two crowds.
Oh.
Yeah.
Now it's just a habit of mine because I can't get that out of my head.
Wow. I love it.
Well, okay, so his
But in parody, maybe he was singing crowd.
here's a phenomenon
Flip-flop,
called
Yeah.
Baden
like turn on the light.
mind
I think-
something. I
I
have
mean,
to
I
look it
think
up.
some of this is Mark's literary
But,
telling a good story.
It's where if you're made aware of something,
It's like having-
then going forward,
similar
you find it.
nature.
Oh,
do
yeah, yeah.
Literary irony there.
It's like
Yeah, well, I thought that.
Good morning.
self-fulfilling prophecy.
Kind of that too.
yeah.
Oh, I have to. make
Now it's
that.
bugging
Sorry,
me,
I got
Paul. What was the
distracted.
name of that group that believed that? We've studied them.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just like.
I don't know. I kept-
kept.
I kept having lyrics from Jesus Christ Superstar in my head today,
did that,
and then
But I don't
Not a
know
White
why
Bride.
I gotta watch, I have to screen.
We did it in.